Sometimes the people who laugh the loudest are the ones who understand the least. For 30 years, they called her crazy, the strange woman living alone in that moss-covered castle up on the mountain. They whispered behind her back at the grocery store and shook their heads when she passed by. But Sorrell Danvers wasn't crazy. She was protecting something no one else could see. Inside those crumbling walls, she spent decades restoring a forgotten piece of history, room by room, with her own 2 hands. Then one day, a surveyor knocked on her door and everything changed. That falling down castle they all mocked. It was worth $12 million. Now those same people want in. But what would you do after years of their ridicule? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like a living thing, weaving between the ancient oaks and maples that surrounded the castle. Sorrell Danvers stood at the edge of her garden, leather gloves dark with soil, surveying the herbs she'd planted along the southern wall. Thyme, rosemary, sage, all the practical ones that didn't need coddling. At 63, she had no patience for plants that couldn't hold their own. The castle rose behind her, a grey stone fortress that seemed to grow directly from the mountain itself. Moss covered the north-facing walls in thick emerald carpet, and ivy climbed the eastern tower in tangled ropes. To anyone passing on the distant valley road below, it looked abandoned, forgotten, a relic slowly being reclaimed by the forest. That's exactly what Sorrell wanted them to think. She pulled a carrot from the soil, brushed off the dirt, and added it to her basket. Her knees protested as she stood. They always did these days, but she ignored them the way she ignored most discomfort. Pain was just information. You acknowledged it and moved on. The sun was breaking through the morning clouds now, sending shafts of light through the canopy. It would be a good day for working in the library. The north wall had been concerning her lately, a slight softness in the plaster that suggested moisture behind it. She'd need to check it again, perhaps open up a small section to see what was happening beneath the surface. Inside, the castle was cool and quiet. Sorrell's boots echoed on the flagstone floor of the entrance hall as she carried her basket to the kitchen. The room was medieval in structure, but practical in function. She'd installed a good wood stove years ago, and the original hearth still worked when she wanted it. The counters were scrubbed pine, the dishes simple ceramic. Everything she needed, nothing she didn't. She washed the carrots at the deep sink, her mind already moving through the day's tasks. Check the library wall. Rebind the spine on that 1780s volume of poetry she'd been working on. Clean the small stained glass panel she'd found in the chapel storage room last month. The work was never finished. That was the point. Sorrell had come to the castle 30 years ago with nothing but a battered car full of books and a heart so broken she couldn't imagine it ever healing. Uncle Thornton had left it to her in his will. A surprise, since she'd only met him twice, both times at family funerals where he'd stood at the edges looking uncomfortable in his formal clothes. She remembered him as tall and weathered, with hands that seemed more comfortable holding tools than shaking hands. The lawyer's letter had arrived 3 days after she'd been asked to resign from the Whitfield Museum. Asked, as if she'd had a choice. As if the scandal hadn't already destroyed her reputation so thoroughly that no institution would touch her. She'd authenticated a painting as a genuine Rembrandt study, had staked her professional credibility on it. The museum's board, pressured by a wealthy donor who'd wanted the piece declared a forgery for insurance purposes, had commissioned a second opinion. That expert, funded by the same donor, had contradicted her. In the politics that followed, Sorrell's voice had been drowned out by money and influence. 6 months later, she'd learned through a colleague that subsequent testing had proven her right. But by then, she was already gone, already here, and she'd discovered she had no desire to go back. The castle had been a ruin when she'd arrived. Not picturesque decay, actual ruin. The roof leaked in a dozen places. Animals nested in the corners. Centuries of neglect had left layers of grime so thick she couldn't tell what color the walls had been. But beneath the damage, she'd seen the bones of something extraordinary. Uncle Thornton had left her a folder with the deed and a single page of notes in his careful handwriting. Don't let them tear it down. It remembers things we've forgotten. She'd spent the first year just learning the building, walking its rooms, listening to how it settled, understanding where water ran, where light fell, which stones were solid and which had begun to crumble. The castle had become her teacher, and she'd been a patient student. The townspeople had started talking almost immediately. She'd gone into the valley for supplies that first month, to the small town of Millbrook, 20 minutes down the winding mountain road, and felt their stares like physical touches. The cashier at the general store had been polite but cool. The woman behind her in line had whispered to her companion, not quite quietly enough, "That's her, the one who bought old Thornton's place. Heard she's some kind of artist. City person." The way she'd said city person made it sound like a diagnosis. Over the years, the whispers had gotten louder. Sorrell made the trip to town once every 2 weeks for supplies she couldn't grow or make herself. She spoke only when necessary, kept her eyes forward, paid in cash. But she heard them anyway. Swamp witch. That crazy woman on the hill, she talks to herself, you know. Old Pete saw her having a full conversation with a tree. She'd been talking to herself, actually, thinking through a problem with the chapel's foundation. But she'd been standing near a tree, and that was apparently all the evidence Pete Garrison needed. There was one exception to the town's collective dismissal. Wendell Cross owned the farm that bordered the eastern edge of her property. He was in his 70s, had hands like gnarled oak roots, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from spending a lifetime watching seasons change. He'd knocked on her door the second winter she was there, carrying a bushel of apples. "Figured you might not have trees bearing yet," he'd said, gruff but not unkind. "These'll keep if you store them right." She'd invited him in for coffee, and he'd stayed for 2 hours, talking about weather patterns and soil composition, and which bears had dens in which parts of the mountain. He'd never once asked what she was doing with the castle, never once looked at her like she was strange for wanting to be here. After that, he'd stop by every few months, bringing apples in fall, checking on her after hard winters, once helping her move a fallen tree that had blocked her road. He was the closest thing to a friend she had. Now finishing her simple breakfast of bread and jam, Sorrell moved through the ground floor to the library. This was the room that had captured her heart first. 2 stories tall, with galleries running around the upper level and tall windows facing east. When she'd first seen it, the windows had been boarded up, the shelves empty and rotting, the floor covered in debris and bird droppings. It had taken her 3 years to restore it. She'd rebuilt the shelves by hand, matching the original oak. Cleaned and repaired each window, replacing broken panes with glass she'd learned to cut herself. Removed the damaged plaster, treated the exposed stone for moisture, and replastered with period-appropriate materials. Then came the books, salvaging what remained in the castle's sealed storage rooms, discovering that Uncle Thornton had protected more than she'd imagined. The collection was extraordinary. First editions, illuminated manuscripts, volumes of poetry and philosophy, and natural history that dated back to the 1700s. Many had been damaged by time and neglect, their bindings cracked, their pages loose. She taught herself bookbinding through library books and careful practice. Thread by thread, page by page, she'd brought them back. Now the library glowed in the morning light. Hundreds of volumes lined the shelves, each one marked in her restoration journal with notes about its condition, treatment, and provenance. The leather reading chairs she'd repaired sat before the fireplace. The globe she'd meticulously restored stood in its corner, showing a world where blank spaces still existed on maps. She ran her hand along the north wall now, feeling for that softness she'd noticed. There, about 4 feet up, a section perhaps 2 feet wide where the plaster gave slightly under pressure. Not good. She'd need to open it up, see what was behind it. Probably just old moisture damage, but you never ignored warning signs in a building this old. Sorrell fetched her tools from the workroom, a converted pantry off the kitchen where she kept everything she needed for restoration work. Carefully, she began to remove a small section of plaster, working slowly to avoid damaging more than necessary. The plaster came away in chunks, revealing the stone wall behind it. And there, set into the stone, was something that shouldn't be there. A wooden panel, clearly not original to the wall's construction. About 2 feet square, fitted so carefully into the stones that you'd never know it was there if you weren't looking. Her heart began to beat faster. In 30 years, she'd found hidden spaces before, a bricked-up fireplace, a sealed storage room, but this was different. This had been concealed deliberately, expertly. She'd leave it for now, map its location precisely, come back with proper tools and better light. Whatever it was, it had waited this long. It could wait a few more hours. But as she carefully replaced the loose plaster, just enough to protect the area, her mind was already spinning through possibilities. Uncle Thornton's note echoed in her memory. It remembers things we've forgotten. The afternoon passed in her usual routine. She worked on the poetry volume, carefully reattaching the spine with period-appropriate glue and thread. Her hands were steady, her focus complete. This was meditation for her, the slow, precise work of restoration. Each repaired page was a small victory against time's decay. Around 4, she made tea and carried it to the great hall. This room still intimidated her sometimes. 40 feet long, with a vaulted ceiling and an enormous fireplace at one end. The walls had been painted once. She'd found traces of murals beneath layers of whitewash, but exposing them would be a decade's work at least. For now, she'd settled for cleaning and stabilizing what was there. The portrait hung above the fireplace. Adelaide Ashford, according to the small brass plate on the frame. The woman in the painting looked to be in her 50s, dressed in the fashion of the late 1700s, with sharp eyes and a slight smile. Sorrell had found the painting in a sealed attic room, covered in dust but miraculously undamaged. It had taken her 6 months to clean it properly, revealing the artist's skill and the subject's character. She felt a kinship with Adelaide, another woman who'd lived in this castle, who'd walked these halls. What had her life been like? The castle suggested wealth, but also isolation. This far up the mountain, visits from the valley would have been rare, especially in winter. What were you protecting? Sorrell asked the portrait, as she sometimes did. What mattered enough to build all this? The painted eyes offered no answers, but Sorrell found comfort in the asking anyway. As evening settled over the mountain, she lit the lamps. She'd installed electricity in the kitchen and workroom, but preferred lamplight in the main rooms, and returned to the library with her restoration journal. She recorded the day's discoveries, the hidden panel's location, dimensions, and condition, drew a small diagram, made notes about the next steps. Outside, the spring frogs were beginning their evening chorus. Nightbirds called from the forest. The castle settled around her with small creaks and sighs, familiar as breathing. This was her life. Solitary, yes, but not lonely. She had purpose. She had work that mattered. She had a place that needed her. The townspeople could think what they wanted. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. Up here, in her fortress of stone and memory, Sorrell Danvers was exactly where she belonged. She didn't know that tomorrow. Everything would change. The knock on the door came at 10 in the morning, sharp and professional. Sorrell was in the chapel, carefully cleaning a section of stained glass she'd removed from one of the upper windows. She'd been lost in the work, in the way light transformed color when freed from centuries of grime, and the sound startled her. No one knocked on her door. Wendell called out as he approached, giving her warning. Delivery drivers left packages at the bottom of the mountain road. The handful of hikers who occasionally wandered too close to the property turned back when they saw the no trespassing signs. She set down her cleaning cloth and moved through the castle to the entrance hall. Through the narrow window beside the door, she could see a man on her front step. 50s, graying hair, wearing a professional jacket over hiking clothes. He held a leather portfolio and was studying the stonework around the doorframe, with the kind of attention that made her immediately wary. Sorrell opened the door only partially, keeping her body in the gap. "This is private property." The man looked up, and she saw surprise flicker across his face. Whatever he'd been expecting, apparently she wasn't it. Ms. Danvers? I'm Corin Mallory. I'm a historical surveyor with the State Preservation Office. He reached into his jacket, slowly, she noticed, as if aware he might seem threatening, and produced a business card. I apologize for showing up unannounced. I've been trying to reach you by phone, but I don't have a phone. Right, yes, that makes sense. He smiled a little awkward. Look, I know this is an intrusion, but I've been researching colonial-era properties in the region, and I have reason to believe your estate may have significant historical value. I was hoping you might allow me to view the property, just briefly, for documentation purposes. No, the word came out flat, final. She'd spent 30 years keeping the world away from this place. She wasn't about to invite it in because some bureaucrat with a portfolio had decided her home was significant. I understand your hesitation, Corin said. His voice was patient, not pushy. But if the estate does have the historical provenance I suspect, there could be preservation funding available. Resources for maintenance, and I maintain it fine on my own. I'm sure you do. But these buildings, they require specialized care and the costs. Thank you for stopping by. Sorrell began to close the door. Please. Something in his voice made her pause. Just the entrance hall. 5 minutes. I've been researching this property for 2 years, and if I'm right about its origins, it could be one of the last intact colonial estates in the entire region. 5 minutes to confirm what I suspect, and then I'll leave. You have my word. Sorrell studied him through the crack in the door. He didn't look like the townspeople. Didn't have that mixture of curiosity and contempt she'd grown used to. He looked tired, honestly, like someone who'd been working on something for a long time and was running out of leads. Against her better judgment, she opened the door wider. 5 minutes. You don't touch anything. You don't go beyond the entrance hall, and then you leave. Agreed. Thank you. She stepped aside and Corin entered. His reaction was immediate and unguarded. He stopped 3 steps inside, his eyes going wide as he took in the space. The entrance hall was one of the areas Sorrell had finished early in her restoration. Flagstone floors cleaned and resealed, stone walls repaired and repointed. The curved staircase leading to the upper floors had been rebuilt where necessary, its oak railing sanded and refinished. Period-appropriate lanterns hung from iron hooks. A tapestry she'd repaired, depicting a hunting scene, covered one wall. My God, Corin whispered. This is original. All of it. Most of it, Sorrell corrected. I've made repairs where necessary, but I matched the original materials and techniques. He moved closer to the staircase, his hand hovering near the railing, but not touching, respecting her boundaries. The joinery work here, this is 18th century craftsmanship. And you've preserved it. He looked at her, something like wonder in his expression. You've actually preserved it. Do you have any idea how rare this is? It's my home. It's history. He was examining the stonework now, the way the blocks fit together. The architectural style suggests late 1700s, possibly connected to the Ashford family. They were prominent patrons in the colonial period, but their properties were thought to have been sold off or demolished generations ago. He turned back to her. How long have you owned this? 30 years. And you've been doing the restoration work yourself? Yes. What's your background? Are you an architect? A historian? Sorrell felt the old defensiveness rising. I was a conservator. I worked in museums before. Before what? Before I didn't anymore. She moved toward the door, making it clear his time was up. You've seen what you came to see. Now please leave. But Corin wasn't moving toward the exit. He was looking down the hallway that led to the library, where morning light was pouring through the tall windows. Is the rest of the property like this? Restored to this standard? That's not your concern. Miss Danvers, if what I'm seeing here represents the condition of the entire estate, you're sitting on something extraordinary. This needs to be documented, preserved, protected. It is protected, Sorrell said sharply. By me, and it will stay that way. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to help. If this property were historically designated, you could qualify for... I don't want designation. I don't want attention. I don't want people like you or anyone else coming here and telling me what I can and can't do with my own home. She pulled the door open, her patience exhausted. Your 5 minutes are up. Please leave. Corin looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right. I respect that. He reached into his portfolio and pulled out another business card. But if you change your mind, or if you ever need help with the restoration work, please call me. What you're doing here, it matters. Even if you don't want anyone to know about it. Sorrell took the card only because refusing it would prolong the conversation. Goodbye, Mr. Mallory. He left, and she closed the door firmly behind him. Through the window, she watched him walk down the path to where a sensible sedan was parked on the gravel drive. He paused once, looking back at the castle, then got in his car and drove away. Sorrell stood in the entrance hall, her heart beating faster than it should. The castle felt violated somehow, even though he'd barely seen anything. For 30 years, this had been hers alone, her sanctuary, her purpose. The thought of outside eyes on it, outside judgments, made her want to check every lock and seal, every window. She looked down at the business card in her hand. Corin Mallory, historical surveyor, a phone number and an email address she couldn't use. She should throw it away. Instead, she slipped it into her pocket. For the rest of the day, she couldn't settle into her work. She found herself walking the rooms, looking at them the way Corin might have looked at them, seeing not just her home, but history, evidence, something that belonged not just to her, but to the past. It was an uncomfortable feeling. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the small chamber she'd converted into living quarters, Sorrell stared at the ceiling and tried to ignore the anxiety humming through her nerves. Nothing had changed. Some surveyor had knocked on her door, looked at one room, and left. That was all. But somehow, it felt like the beginning of something she couldn't stop. 3 days after Corin Mallory's visit, Sorrell stood in the general store in Millbrook, waiting for Harold Beck to ring up her supplies. The store was the same as it had been for 30 years. Narrow aisles packed with everything from canned goods to work gloves, the smell of old wood and coffee, a radio playing country music nobody really listened to. Harold was deliberate with the register, checking each price twice. He'd never been warm to her, but he'd never been overtly rude either. He treated her the way you'd treat a strange relative you were obligated to acknowledge. Polite distance, nothing more. That'll be $47.50, he said. Not meeting her eyes, Sorrell counted out the bills and was turning to leave when the bell over the door chimed. 2 women entered, both probably in their 60s, both wearing the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested they took their position in town seriously. She recognized them vaguely. They were fixtures at town gatherings she never attended, asking all sorts of questions, one was saying to the other. About property records and old families and such. Helen said he spent 2 hours at the Historical Society going through archives. What's he looking for? Something about colonial estates, apparently. Helen said he was very interested in the old Thornton place. You know where that strange woman lives. Sorrell kept her face neutral, gathering her bags. The one with the falling-down castle? The second woman laughed. What could possibly be historical about that pile of rocks? It's been nothing but an eyesore for 50 years. That's what I said. But apparently, this surveyor fellow thinks there might be something worth documenting up there. He was asking if anyone in town knew about the property's history. Well, I hope he has good boots. I heard she's practically feral. Lives up there like some kind of hermit. Harold cleared his throat loudly, jerking his head slightly towards Sorrell. Both women turned, and the recognition hit them simultaneously. Their faces shifted through surprise, embarrassment, and then a kind of defensive stubbornness. Oh, the first woman said. We didn't see you there. Clearly, Sorrell picked up her bags and walked past them without another word. Behind her, she heard whispered conversation resume. Voices just low enough that she couldn't make out words, but could feel their intent. She'd stopped caring what they said years ago, or at least she'd gotten very good at pretending she'd stopped caring. The drive back up the mountain was steep and winding, her old truck protesting the grade. She focused on the road, on the familiar landmarks, the lightning-split oak, the spot where a spring ran across the road in wet seasons, the turn where you could first glimpse the castle through the trees, but her mind was churning. Corin Mallory had been making inquiries. Of course he had. That's what people like him did. They poked and prodded and turned over rocks until they found what they were looking for. And now the town was talking about it, which meant it was only a matter of time before curiosity turned into something more active. Back at the castle, she put away her supplies with more force than necessary, cans hitting shelves hard. She was angry, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The castle was hers. Legal deed, clear title. What did it matter if some surveyor wanted to document it, or if the townspeople suddenly found it interesting? But it did matter, because for 30 years she'd been invisible here, dismissed, and that dismissal had been a kind of protection. The town's contempt meant they stayed away. Now, though, curiosity was stirring, and curiosity had a way of turning into intrusion. She went to the library, to the section of wall where she'd found the hidden panel. She'd been avoiding it since Corin's visit, superstitious in a way she didn't quite understand. But now, still agitated from the encounter in town, she fetched her tools and began carefully removing the plaster she'd temporarily replaced. The wooden panel came into view again. In better light, she could see the craftsmanship of it, how carefully it had been fitted, how the wood had been sealed against moisture. Someone had gone to significant trouble to hide this and preserve whatever was inside. Her hands were steadier now, the work calming her the way it always did. She examined the panel's edges, looking for the best way to remove it without damage. There, a slight gap at the top, just wide enough to work a thin blade into. 20 minutes of careful work, and the panel loosened. She lifted it free, setting it aside, and peered into the space behind. At first, all she could see was darkness. She fetched a flashlight from her workroom, and its beam revealed a cavity about 2 feet deep, extending into the wall between the stones. Inside, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, were several objects. Sorrell's breath caught. This wasn't just a hidden space. This was a deliberate cache. Someone had placed these things here, protected them, concealed them with the intention that they'd survive time, carefully. With the reverence she'd learned in her museum days, she began to remove the items. The oilcloth crackled, brittle with age but still intact. Inside the first package, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but readable. The second package, what looked like documents folded and sealed. The third, a small wooden box, surprisingly heavy. She carried everything to the library table, her heart racing now. This was more than she'd expected. This was more than just a hidden space. She opened the journal first, handling it with gentle fingers. The handwriting inside was feminine, elegant, dated 1789. The first entry began, "I, Adelaide Ashford, record this for whoever may find it in times I cannot foresee. Adelaide." The woman in the portrait. Sorrell looked up at the painting in the great hall, visible through the library's doorway, and felt a chill run through her. The woman she'd talked to for years, the face she'd carefully restored. Adelaide had left this, had hidden it, had wanted someone to find it. But before she could read further, a sound reached her from outside, a truck engine coming up the mountain road. She went to the window and saw Wendell's familiar pickup pulling up to the drive. She met him at the door, and his expression was serious. "Thought you should know," he said without preamble. "There's been talk in town. That surveyor who came up here, he's got people curious. Preston Gill was asking questions at the feed store this morning. Wanted to know about property values up here, about whether the Thornton estate was for sale. Preston Gill. The name meant nothing to her. Developer from Riverdale. Bought up half the old Morrison farm last year, put in those townhouses. He's got a nose for property he thinks he can flip." Wendell shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I don't trust him, Sorrell. And I don't like him asking questions about your place. Let him ask. The castle's not for sale, I know that. But Gill's the type who doesn't hear no so much as make me a better offer. You might want to be prepared for him to come calling." After Wendell left, Sorrell returned to the library, to Adelaide's journal, and the mysterious documents still waiting to be examined. But the joy of discovery was tainted now with worry. The outside world had noticed her castle, and once the outside world noticed something, it rarely lost interest. She thought of Corin Mallory's card, still in her pocket. Then she looked at the documents on the table, at Adelaide's elegant handwriting, at secrets that had waited more than 200 years to be found. Whatever was happening, she had a feeling it had only just begun. Corinne Mallory sat in the cramped back office of the Regional Historical Society, surrounded by boxes that smelled of old paper and slowly decaying cardboard. He'd been here for 6 hours, and his eyes ached from reading faded handwriting by insufficient light. But he was close to something. He could feel it. The Ashford family had been prominent in the late 1700s, that much was documented. Wealthy merchants who transitioned into land ownership and patronage of the arts. They'd built several properties throughout the region, including a grand manor house that served as their primary residence. That manor was long gone, demolished in the 1850s to make way for a railroad, but there had been other properties. Smaller estates, hunting lodges, retreats. Most were accounted for in the historical record. Most, but not all. Corinne pulled out another file, this one containing a surveyor's map from 1792. His finger traced the mountain range where Sorrell's castle stood. There, a notation in the margin, Ashford Mountain Estate Artistic Collection, Artistic Collection. His pulse quickened, he cross-referenced with another document, an inventory from the Ashford family's bankruptcy proceedings in 1810. The family had overextended themselves, made bad investments, lost their fortune in a series of unfortunate ventures. Their properties were seized, their possessions sold at auction. Except the mountain estate wasn't listed, wasn't mentioned at all in the bankruptcy documents. Corinne sat back, thinking, if the estate existed in 1792 but wasn't seized in 1810, someone had deliberately kept it out of the proceedings. Hidden it, protected it from creditors. The question was why. And what had been inside that was worth protecting. He thought of the entrance hall he'd glimpsed in Sorrell's castle. The quality of the restoration, yes, but also the structure itself. That kind of stonework, that level of craftsmanship, it suggested the building had once housed something valuable. You didn't build a fortress unless you had something worth fortifying. His phone buzzed. A text from his ex-wife, something about their daughter's college tuition payment. He'd deal with it later. Right now, this mattered more. That thought stopped him. When had an old building started mattering more than his own family's finances? When had he become the kind of person who lost himself in archives while real life demanded attention? He knew the answer. It had happened gradually over the past 5 years since the divorce, since he'd realized that the careful career he'd built, the safe government position, the steady but uninspiring work, had cost him the things he'd actually cared about. His marriage, his relationship with his daughter, the passion that had drawn him to historical work in the first place. Now he was 52, living alone in a rental apartment, and chasing stories about dead families and forgotten estates because it was easier than facing how empty his actual life had become. Except this didn't feel empty. This felt like it mattered. And that woman, Sorrell Danvers, with her fierce protectiveness and obvious skill, she was protecting something real, something important. Even if she'd never let anyone see it, Corinne gathered his notes and left the Historical Society. The drive back to his apartment took 40 minutes, enough time for him to talk himself out of what he was about to do at least 3 times. But he did it anyway. He called the State Preservation Office and requested an emergency consultation about a potentially significant historical property. Gave them the preliminary information he'd gathered. They were interested, very interested, and promised to send additional resources for research. He hung up and immediately felt guilty. Sorrell had been clear. She wanted to be left alone. And here he was, setting in motion a process that would bring exactly the kind of attention she'd spent 30 years avoiding. But if he was right about the estate's significance, it needed proper protection. Legal designation, funding for preservation. These buildings didn't last forever, and one person, no matter how dedicated, couldn't maintain something that large indefinitely. He was doing the right thing. He had to believe that. Back at the castle, Sorrell had spent the evening reading Adelaide's journal by lamplight. The entries were sporadic, covering several years, But a story was emerging. Adelaide had been married to Jonathan Ashford, a man of significant wealth but poor judgment. He'd made increasingly risky investments, ignoring Adelaide's advice, betting their fortune on ventures that collapsed one after another. "He will not listen," Adelaide wrote in 1808. "I have shown him the accounts, explained where we stand, but he dismisses my concerns as feminine worry. Meanwhile, creditors circle like wolves. I fear what will come when they finally strike." The entries grew more urgent. Adelaide had begun moving things to the mountain estate: artwork, books, documents, anything of cultural value that she thought might be seized and sold. She'd been preparing for the collapse, trying to save what she could. "I have made arrangements with Thomas," one entry read. Thomas was their head steward, a man Adelaide clearly trusted deeply. "He will become the legal owner of the mountain property. A fiction but necessary. When the creditors come, they will find nothing to take. And Thomas will protect what we have placed there until a time when it might be safe to reveal it again." Sorrell turned the page and a loose sheet fell out. A letter in different handwriting. She read it slowly, her hands starting to shake. The letter was from Thomas, written years later, explaining that he'd passed the estate to his son, with instructions to protect it. The son passed it to his son. A chain of stewardship, generation after generation, keeping the secret, maintaining the fiction that the estate was nothing special. And then, 3 generations down, the estate had passed to Thornton. Uncle Thornton, who'd had no children of his own, who'd needed someone to pass the responsibility to, who'd chosen Sorrell, not randomly, not by accident. He'd observed her at those funerals, seen something in her that suggested she'd be suited for the role. Dedicated, solitary, capable of keeping secrets. She thought of his note. "Don't let them tear it down. It remembers things we've forgotten." He'd known, had known exactly what he was giving her. Not just a building, but a trust. A responsibility that stretched back more than 2 centuries. Sorrell stood and walked to the great hall, to Adelaide's portrait. The woman looked back at her with those knowing eyes, that slight smile. They were connected now, she and Adelaide. Both women who'd protected this place. Both women who'd sacrificed for something they believed mattered more than themselves. "I understand," Sorrell said softly to the painting. "I understand why you did it, but understanding brought new weight. Because if this really was what she suspected, if the castle held Adelaide's entire artistic collection, pieces that had been hidden for 200 years, then it wasn't just her home anymore. It was history, evidence, something that belonged to more than just her. The question was what to do about it. Corinne Mallory had offered help, resources, protection. But accepting those things meant opening the gates, letting the world in, risking everything she'd built here. Outside, rain began to fall. The sound on the stone walls was like whispers. All the people who'd walked these halls over the centuries, all the hands that had touched these stones. She was just one link in a chain, one guardian in a long line of guardians, but she was the one here now. The decision was hers to make. She went to bed with the journal on her nightstand, with Adelaide's words echoing in her mind. In the darkness, listening to the rain, Sorrell tried to imagine what the woman in the portrait would have wanted. Whether she'd hidden her collection, hoping it would stay hidden forever, or hoping that someday someone would reveal it. There was no way to know. The dead kept their intentions to themselves. All Sorrell could do was what felt right. And right now that meant keeping the gates closed, and the secret safe, at least for now. The rot in the library wall was worse than Sorrell had thought. She'd opened up a larger section of plaster, and the wood framing behind it was soft, dark with moisture damage. The source wasn't immediately obvious. No obvious leak from above, no crack in the stone, but water had been getting in somehow, and over time it had done its work. This wasn't something she could fix alone, not properly. The framing would need to be replaced, which meant removing more plaster, possibly affecting the structural integrity of that entire section of wall. And the cost of materials alone would strain her limited savings. She sat on the library floor, surrounded by chunks of plaster and rotted wood, and felt something close to despair. For 30 years she'd managed, had kept ahead of the building's needs through careful planning and endless work. But she was 63 now, and the castle was nearly 300 years old, and time was winning. Corinne Mallory's business card sat on the table behind her. She'd looked at it a dozen times over the past week, always stopping short of actually making the call. But now, staring at the damaged wall, she pulled out her cell phone, the cheap prepaid one she kept for emergencies and never actually used, and dialed before she could change her mind. He answered on the second ring. "Corinne Mallory. This is Sorrell Danvers." A pause. Then carefully, "Miss Danvers, thank you for calling. The library has structural damage. Water damage to the framing? I need—" She stopped, the words catching. "I need an assessment, professional, before I can determine how to proceed with repairs. I can be there tomorrow morning." 9 o'clock? Fine. She hung up before he could say anything else. The next morning, she was waiting when his car came up the drive. She'd spent the night second-guessing the decision, but the damaged wall remained damaged, and pride wouldn't fix it. Corinne got out of his car, carrying a professional camera and a toolbox. He looked more prepared than he had on his first visit, like he'd been hoping for this call. "Thank you for reaching out," he said. "I know it wasn't easy. The library is this way." She led him through the entrance hall and down the corridor. She could feel him looking at everything, the tapestries, the stonework, the careful repairs she'd made over decades. But he didn't comment, just followed quietly, professionally. In the library, she showed him the damaged section. He knelt beside it, examining the rot with a small flashlight, taking photos, making notes. "How long have you noticed the moisture?" "A few weeks. But the damage is older, probably been developing for years." He probed the wood gently with a tool from his kit. "The good news is it's localized. The structural stones are fine. This is just the interior framing. The bad news is you'll need to remove this entire section, treat the stone for moisture, replace the framing, and replaster. It's not a small job, I know. May I check the exterior to see where the water's coming in?" She nodded, and they went outside. The day was cool and clear, last night's rain leaving everything smelling fresh. Corinne walked the perimeter of the library's exterior wall, examining the stonework, the mortar, the roofline above. "There," he said finally, pointing to a section where two walls met. "The flashing is failing. Water's running down the corner and seeping into the interior wall. It's fixable, but you'll need a mason who understands historic stonework." "How much?" The question came out harder than she'd intended. "For proper repair, materials and labor, probably 8,000 to 10,000. Sorrell felt the number like a physical blow. She had maybe 3,000 in savings. The castle generated no income. Her small inheritance from Uncle Thornton had run out years ago. She lived on almost nothing, grew most of her food, made do with what she had. 8,000 might as well be 80,000. Corinne must have seen something in her face. "The funding I mentioned, through historical designation, that could cover this completely and provide ongoing maintenance support." "At what cost?" "Documentation. Public access but limited. You'd have control over when and how much. The property would be protected by historical preservation laws, which means no one could force you to sell or develop it. It would be secure, and I'd have to let people in, let them see it, a few times a month. Small groups. Supervised tours." He paused. "Miss Danvers, I understand your reluctance, I do. But this building, it's bigger than either of us. If it's what I think it is, it's one of the last intact examples of colonial-era preservation in the region. That matters, not just historically but culturally. And right now, you're fighting a losing battle against time and weather. Let me help. Let the system help." Sorrell looked back at the castle, at the stone walls she'd spent 3 decades maintaining. He was right about the battle. She'd known it for years, but had refused to admit it. One person couldn't hold back time indefinitely. Eventually, something had to give. "I need to show you something," she said. She led him back inside, to the library, to the documents she'd found in the hidden panel. She'd been keeping them locked in a cabinet, unsure what to do with them. Now she spread them on the table, Adelaide's journal, the letters, the inventory lists. Corin's hands were shaking as he examined them. He put on cotton gloves before touching anything, his training evident. My God, these are Ms. Danvers. These are primary source documents from the Ashford family. Do you understand what this means? It means Adelaide hid her collection here, saved it from creditors. It means this castle is potentially housing artwork and artifacts that have been considered lost for 2 centuries. He looked up at her, his eyes bright. What else have you found? She hesitated. Then, come with me. She took him through the castle, room by room, showing him what she'd restored. The chapel with its stained glass, the great hall with Adelaide's portrait, the upper floors with their period furniture, carefully maintained. The sealed storage rooms where she'd found books, paintings, sculptures, all carefully wrapped and preserved, waiting. She'd spent 30 years alone with these treasures, talking to them, caring for them. Now, watching Corin's face as he took in the scope of what she'd protected, she felt something shift. Not quite relief, but maybe recognition. That what she'd done mattered, that someone else could see it. In what had once been the music room, Corin stopped in front of a painting she'd cleaned and restored. It showed a landscape, mountains, a valley, done in a style that suggested significant skill. This is unsigned, but the technique looks like... He leaned closer. This could be a genuine colonial-era landscape, possibly one of only a handful still in existence. There are 6 more in storage, Sorrell said quietly, along with 3 portraits, a collection of botanical sketches, and what I believe are architectural drawings of the original estate. Corin turned to her, and she saw tears in his eyes. You've been guarding a museum, all alone, for 30 years. I've been guarding my home. It's both. He wiped his face, embarrassed. I'm sorry. It's just, in my line of work, you spend most of your time documenting things that have already been lost, trying to piece together what was from fragments and references. And here you are, sitting on something that survived completely intact, and nobody knew. Nobody appreciated what you were doing. I didn't do it for appreciation. I know, but you deserve it anyway. He looked around the room, at the careful work evident in every corner. Will you let me document this properly? Will you let me help you protect it, not from you, but for you? Sorrell walked to the window. Outside, the mountains stretched away toward the valley, toward the town that had dismissed her for 3 decades. If she said yes, those people would come here, would see what she'd built, would want to claim some part of it, some credit, but they'd also help her save it. And wasn't that what mattered? Not her pride, not her solitude, but the survival of what Adelaide had tried so hard to preserve. I need to think about it, she said finally. Of course. Take your time. Corin gathered his equipment. But Miss Danvers, Sorrell, if I may, whatever you decide, thank you for showing me this. It's extraordinary. You're extraordinary. After he left, Sorrell sat in the library with Adelaide's journal open in front of her. She turned to one of the later entries, dated shortly before Adelaide's death. I do not know if what I have saved will ever be seen again. Perhaps it will moulder here forever, forgotten. But I choose to believe that someone will find it, someone who will understand what it meant, what it means, and they will make the choice I could not, whether to hide it still or let the world remember. Sorrell closed the journal slowly. Adelaide had left the choice to her, to whoever came after. And now, sitting in a castle full of hidden beauty, Sorrell had to decide what that choice would be. Preston Gill arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a Mercedes SUV that looked absurdly out of place on the rough mountain road. Sorrell was in the garden when she heard the engine, and she stood with dirt on her hands, watching a man in an expensive suit pick his way across the gravel drive like he was navigating a minefield. Miss Danvers? He had a smile that showed too many teeth. Preston Gill, I'm a property developer working in the region. I was hoping we could chat for a moment about your beautiful property here. No, she turned back to her weeding. I understand you're a private person. I respect that. But I represent a group of investors who are very interested in historical properties with development potential. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer, not for sale. You haven't heard the offer yet. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. We're talking about substantial money. Enough that you could buy a lovely home in town, closer to amenities, easier to maintain. And this property, well, with the right investment, it could become something special. A boutique hotel, perhaps, or a venue for weddings and events. The bones are here. It just needs vision. Sorrell stood facing him fully. The bones are 300 years old. This is a historic estate, not a development opportunity. Everything is a development opportunity with the right approach. His smile didn't waver. Look, I understand attachment to property, but you're sitting on land that's worth a fortune, and you're living like— He gestured vaguely at her gardening clothes, her weathered hands. Well, let's just say you could be living much more comfortably. I'm comfortable now. Are you? He glanced at the castle, at the moss-covered walls. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like this place is falling down around you. How much longer can you really maintain it? What happens when the roof finally goes? When the walls start to crumble? You're one person, Miss Danvers, one aging person. This building will outlast you, and then what? It gets condemned and demolished anyway. The words stung because they held a truth she'd been trying to ignore. I said it's not for sale. Please leave. Preston's smile finally faded. I should mention that there have been some concerns raised with the county. Property tax assessments, building code compliance. It would be unfortunate if inspectors had to come out here and find violations. Very unfortunate for you. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of realities. This county has regulations, Miss Danvers. Structures have to meet certain standards, especially if they're as old as this one. Now, if the property were under new ownership, if we were planning renovations, the county would be much more flexible. But as things stand, he shrugged, I'd hate to see you forced out by bureaucracy when you could walk away with a substantial check instead. Sorrell's hands clenched. Get off my property. Think about my offer. I'll be in touch. He placed a business card on the garden wall and walked back to his Mercedes. After he left, Sorrell stood shaking with anger and fear. The threat had been thinly veiled but clear. Preston Gill had connections, money, and a desire for her property. If he couldn't buy it, he'd find another way to take it. She went inside and called Wendell. He arrived within an hour, and she told him everything. Corin's visits, the documents she'd found, Preston Gill's threat. Wendell listened, his weathered face growing more concerned. Gill's got 2 county commissioners in his pocket, he said finally. If he pushes for inspections, they'll happen. And you know as well as I do that a building this old, they'll find violations. Doesn't matter how well you've maintained it. They'll find something, so what do I do? You need protection, legal protection, the kind that comes with historical designation. He held up a hand before she could protest. I know you value your privacy, Sorrell. I've respected it for 30 years. But sometimes you have to choose between being alone and being safe. And right now, Gill's circling like a hawk. You need to make yourself too valuable to touch. That evening, Sorrell called Corin, the historical designation. What exactly would it involve? His voice was careful, not wanting to push too hard. First, I'd complete a comprehensive documentation of the property. Photographs, architectural surveys, condition reports. Then I'd submit an application to the State Register of Historic Places. If approved, and based on what I've seen it would be, the property gets legal protection against demolition or significant alteration. It also qualifies you for preservation grants. And the public access? That's negotiable. We could start with just 4 open days a year. Small groups, limited to certain rooms. You'd have full control over what visitors see and when they see it. 4 days, 4 days. The rest of the year, it's still your private home. But those 4 days give the property public value, which strengthens the legal protections significantly. Sorrell looked around her kitchen, at the life she'd built in solitude. 4 days a year didn't sound like much, but it felt like opening floodgates. Once people knew what was here, would they ever really leave her alone? There's something else you should know, Corin continued. I've been contacted by Preston Gill. He wanted to know what I'd found in my surveys, whether the property had any real historical value. I didn't tell him anything, but he's clearly interested. And from what I know about him, he doesn't give up easily. He came here today, made an offer. then threatened me with code violations. That's his pattern. He did the same thing to the Morrison family before he bought their farm." Corin paused. "Sorrell, the best defense against someone like Gil is to make your property untouchable. Historical designation does that. He can't force you to sell if the property is protected by state law. She knew he was right, knew she was out of options, but it still felt like surrender, like admitting she couldn't do this alone anymore. "Send me the paperwork," she said finally. "I'll review it. I'll bring it tomorrow. And Sorrell, you're making the right choice." After she hung up, she walked through the castle, touching walls she'd repaired, running her hands along railings she'd refinished. She'd given 30 years to this place. 30 years of solitude, of purpose, of finding meaning in preservation. The thought of strangers walking these halls felt like violation, but Adelaide had hidden her collection, hoping it would survive, hoping someone would protect it. And protection sometimes meant sharing the burden. In the great hall, she stood before Adelaide's portrait. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked the painted face. "For people to see what you saved?" The portrait offered no answers. But in Adelaide's slight smile, Sorrell thought she detected something like approval, or maybe just understanding. That sometimes the hardest part of protecting something wasn't the work itself, but knowing when to ask for help. That night, she pulled out Uncle Thornton's old pocket watch from her nightstand drawer. She'd kept it for 30 years, had wound it occasionally, though it never ran properly. The hands were frozen at 3:47, the hour she'd first arrived at the castle, overwhelmed and heartbroken and looking for escape. She'd found much more than escape. She'd found purpose, but purpose had kept her isolated, and isolation had left her vulnerable. Now she had to evolve or lose everything she'd built. She set the watch back in the drawer and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow, Corin would bring the paperwork. She'd sign it. And then, well, then the gates would begin to open, just a crack. And she'd have to trust that what lay beyond them wouldn't destroy what lay within. The wall repair had begun. Corin had brought in a mason he trusted, an older man named Vincent, who'd worked on historic properties for 40 years, and understood the importance of period-appropriate techniques. They'd been working for 3 days, carefully removing the damaged framing, when Vincent's crowbar hit something that gave a hollow thunk. "Hold on," he said, setting down his tools. "There's something here." Sorrell and Corin crowded closer as Vincent carefully worked his fingers around what appeared to be a stone that wasn't quite seated properly in the wall. With gentle pressure, it shifted, revealing a cavity behind it. "Another hidden space," Sorrell breathed. Vincent stepped back, understanding this wasn't his discovery to make. Sorrell reached into the opening, her hands finding what felt like a metal box. She pulled it out carefully. It was heavy, perhaps a foot square, made of tin that had been sealed with wax. They carried it to the library table. Sorrell's hands shook as she worked at the seal. It cracked and fell away in pieces, and the lid opened with a faint pop of released pressure. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of documents. But these were different from Adelaide's journal. These were legal papers, official seals, still visible despite 2 centuries of age. And beneath them, nestled in velvet that had faded to colorless gray, was a collection of jewelry. Rings, necklaces, brooches, all clearly valuable even to Sorrell's untrained eye. Corin put on his cotton gloves and began examining the documents with infinite care. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something like shock. "What is it?" Sorrell asked. "These are property deeds and letters." And he picked up one particular document, reading it slowly. "Sorrell, this is a letter from Adelaide Ashford to her steward, Thomas." He began to read aloud. "My dear Thomas, if you are reading this, the worst has come to pass, and my husband's follies have brought ruin upon our family. By now, the creditors will have seized our properties and possessions, but you and I have worked in secret these past months to save what matters most. The mountain estate is now in your name, held in trust, as we discussed. Within its walls, I have placed the entirety of our artistic collection, the paintings, the sculptures, the books that my family spent generations assembling. All that beauty, protected from those who would see it merely as assets to be liquidated. I charge you with this sacred duty. Maintain the estate. Keep it hidden. And when the time is right, when the world has moved past this era of greed and destruction, pass this responsibility to someone who will understand its value. Not for money, not for fame, but for the preservation of beauty itself. The enclosed deeds and documents prove your ownership. The jewelry I leave as resources for the estate's maintenance over the years. Use it wisely, sell what you must, but never abandon the trust. I do not know what the future holds, but I choose to believe that centuries from now, someone will walk these halls and understand what we tried to do. Someone will see the art we saved and know it was worth saving. Until that day comes, the collection must remain hidden, protected, waiting, with deepest gratitude and faith. Adelaide Ashford, written this 15th day of March, 1809. The silence that followed was profound. Sorrell felt dizzy, as if the room had tilted. Thomas wasn't just protecting the building. He owned it legally, and he passed it down through his family line. Corin shuffled through more documents. Here, a deed transfer from Thomas to his son, William, and another from William to his son, Robert. Generation after generation, keeping the trust. He looked up at her. Your Uncle Thornton, he was the last in that line, and he passed it to you. But why me? He barely knew me. Corin pulled out another letter, this one in more recent handwriting. This is from Thornton. Listen, to whoever executes my estate, the mountain property goes to Sorrell Danvers, my brother's granddaughter. I've observed her at family gatherings. She has the eye of a conservator, the patience of a restorer, the temperament of a guardian. She has also known loss and understands the value of sanctuary. The estate requires someone who will see it not as property, but as purpose. I believe she is that someone. Enclosed are documents explaining the true history of the estate and the trust that has protected it. She must decide for herself whether to continue that trust or to finally reveal what Adelaide Ashford worked so hard to preserve. The choice is hers, but I believe she will choose wisely. Sorrell sat down heavily. Her entire understanding of the past 30 years had just shifted. She hadn't stumbled into this by chance, hadn't inherited a random property from a distant relative. She'd been chosen, selected, handed a responsibility that stretched back more than 2 centuries. The jewelry alone is probably worth $500,000, Corin said, examining a necklace with professional care. These are period pieces, high quality. Adelaide liquidated some of her personal wealth to create a maintenance fund. And no one knew, Sorrell whispered. For 200 years, the Ashford collection has been sitting here, and no one knew until now. Corin set down the necklace. Sorrell, do you understand what this means? If the collection is intact, if it's been properly preserved, we're talking about one of the most significant historical discoveries in the region's history. Colonial-era art, furniture, documents, all in their original context. Museums would... No, the word came out sharp. No museums. No institutions. That's exactly what Adelaide was afraid of. She didn't want her collection broken up and sold off. She wanted it kept together, protected, but hidden forever. Is that really what she wanted? Corin gestured to the letter. She said, when the world has moved past this era of greed. Maybe she meant for it to be revealed eventually. When it was safe, Sorrell stood and walked to the window. Outside, spring was progressing. The forest was thick with new leaves, birds calling from the canopy. The world Adelaide had known was gone. The threats she'd feared, creditors, greed, the liquidation of beauty for profit, those still existed, but in different forms. Preston Gill wanted to turn the castle into a hotel. The town had mocked it for decades as an eyesore, and she, Sorrell, had spent 30 years hiding it all away, just as Adelaide had wanted. But Adelaide had also written, when the world has moved past this era of greed and destruction, maybe she'd meant when people could appreciate art for its own sake again, when beauty mattered more than profit. Or maybe, Sorrell thought, looking at Corin's eager face, she'd meant when someone came along who genuinely cared about preservation, who saw the collection not as money but as history. The historical designation, she said slowly. If we pursue it, we'll have to disclose what's here. All of it. Not all of it. Not immediately. We can document the building's structure and history without revealing the full extent of the collection. At least until you're ready. And when I'm ready, what happens then? Corin came to stand beside her at the window. Then we share it. Carefully, respectfully. We create a proper museum environment here in the castle itself. We bring in conservation experts to assess each piece. We publish the findings in academic journals. We allow researchers and students to study the collection. And yes, eventually we open it to limited public viewing. Not because of the money it could generate, but because beauty like this, it's meant to be seen. Not by everyone, not all the time, but by those who will truly appreciate it. Adelaide hid it. Adelaide had no choice. Her world was collapsing. But your world, our world, there are structures now. Legal protections, historical societies, people who dedicate their lives to preserving exactly this kind of cultural heritage. He paused. You've been the guardian for 30 years. You've done Adelaide's work brilliantly, but maybe it's time to share the burden, to let the collection finally emerge from hiding. Sorrell touched the window glass, cool against her palm. She thought of Adelaide, spending her final years knowing her life's work was hidden away, hoping someone would find it someday. She thought of Thomas and all the descendants who'd kept the secret, maintained the trust. She thought of Uncle Thornton, choosing her from all the possible heirs because he saw something in her. And she thought of herself at 33, arriving at this castle with a broken heart and ruined career, finding purpose in these walls. The work had healed her, given her 3 decades of meaning, but maybe the healing was complete now. Maybe it was time for the next phase. The appraisal, she said. You mentioned an appraisal. What would the estate be worth? If the collection is what we think it is. Corin hesitated. I'd need experts to give exact numbers, but based on what I've seen, the building, the land, the artwork, the historical significance, we're talking about millions. Possibly 10 to 12 million? Maybe more. 12 million. The number was absurd, meaningless. She'd lived on almost nothing for 30 years and been content. Money didn't matter, but protection did. And with that kind of value attached to the property, the protections would be ironclad. Preston Gill couldn't touch it. The county couldn't condemn it. It would be safe, not just for her lifetime, but forever. All right, she said. We document everything. We pursue full historical designation. And then, she took a breath. And then we decide together what to reveal and when. But we do it right, the way Adelaide would have wanted. Corin smiled, and she saw relief and excitement in his face. We'll do it right, I promise. That night, alone in her chamber, Sorrell reread Adelaide's letter by lamplight. Someone will walk these halls and understand what we tried to do. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 2 centuries pressing down. She understood. She'd always understood. And now, finally, she was going to make sure everyone else understood too. The news leaked on a Friday morning. Sorrell never discovered exactly how, whether it was Vincent the Mason talking at a bar, or someone at the county offices noticing the historical designation application, or just the inevitable result of too many people knowing too much. But by noon, her phone was ringing constantly, and by evening there were 3 reporters at the bottom of her road, cameras ready. She stood at her window watching them, feeling violated. This was exactly what she'd feared. The world pressing in, demanding access, treating her home like a spectacle. Corin arrived within an hour of her calling him, navigating past the reporters with a curt no comment. Inside, he found Sorrell in the library, staring at Adelaide's portrait with an expression somewhere between fury and despair. How did they find out? She asked. Does it matter? They know there's something here. We can either control the narrative or let them create their own. He set his laptop on the table. I've drafted a press release. It confirms that the estate is undergoing historical assessment and may contain significant colonial-era artifacts. It states that you're pursuing preservation, not sale, and that public access will be extremely limited. It asks for privacy during the documentation process. They won't respect that. Probably not. But it gives us a position to stand on. He pulled up a chair. Sorrell, this was always going to happen once we started the designation process. I'm sorry it's happening faster than we planned, but we can manage it. Can we? She gestured toward the window. Preston Gill is going to see this as an opportunity. So is everyone else who's ever dismissed this place as a pile of rocks. Suddenly it's valuable, and they'll all want a piece. Let them want. The designation protects you. Once the paperwork goes through, and with what we've found it will go through quickly, the property becomes legally untouchable. Preston Gill can't force you out. The county can't condemn it. You'll have protection, and in exchange, I lose my privacy. Corin was quiet for a moment. Then yes, to some degree, yes. But isn't that better than losing everything? She knew he was right, had known it since the moment she'd agreed to the designation. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. The castle had been her sanctuary for 30 years. Now it was about to become public property, at least partially. The transformation felt like betrayal, even though she was the one choosing it. Over the weekend, the story grew. Local news picked it up. Reclusive woman may be sitting on historical treasure. The article was mostly speculation, but it included an old photograph of the castle. Someone had hiked up and taken it from a distance, and quotes from townspeople who suddenly remembered, always thinking there was something special about that old place. Sorrell read the quotes with bitter amusement. The same people who'd called her crazy now claimed they'd always suspected historical significance. The shopkeeper who'd barely spoken to her for 30 years was quoted saying he'd always respected her dedication to preservation. Wendell came by Sunday evening, carrying a casserole his wife had made. Town's talking about nothing else, he said. Half think you're about to be rich, other half think it's all nonsense. Preston Gill's been asking questions at the diner, trying to figure out what you've really got here. Let him ask. He's also been talking to county officials. Something about code enforcement and safety inspections. I don't trust it, Sorrell. Neither did she. But Corin had assured her the designation application would protect against that kind of harassment. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Preston Gill wasn't the type to give up just because of legal paperwork. Monday morning brought a new development. Corin arrived with a woman in her 60s, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Sorrell's truck. This is Dr. Patricia Rains, Corin said. She's the director of the State Historical Preservation Office. She's here to expedite your application. Dr. Rains offered her hand. Miss Danvers, I've reviewed the preliminary documentation Corin submitted. If what he's described is accurate, this could be the most significant historical discovery in our state in the past 50 years. I'd like to see it for myself. Sorrell looked at Corin, who nodded encouragingly. This was it. The moment when she let authority into her sanctuary, when she surrendered control to the system. She led them through the castle, room by room. Dr. Rains asked questions in a brisk, professional manner, taking notes on a tablet, occasionally requesting to examine something more closely. In the library, she spent 20 minutes reviewing Adelaide's journal and the documents they'd found in the wall. Extraordinary, she murmured. The provenance is impeccable. A direct chain of custody from 1809 to present day. She looked at Sorrell with something like awe. And you've maintained all of this alone? For 30 years? Yes. The quality of your restoration work. May I ask about your training? I was a conservator before. Sorrell kept her voice neutral, not offering more. Well, your skills are evident. This is museum-quality work. Dr. Rains made more notes. I'm prepared to fast-track your designation. Based on what I've seen this morning, I can have preliminary approval within 2 weeks. Full designation within 60 days. That fast? Corin sounded surprised. When something is this significant, we move quickly. And frankly, given the media attention already building, it's in everyone's interest to get legal protections in place as soon as possible. She turned to Sorrell. I understand this is difficult for you, that you've valued your privacy. But I want you to know that we're not here to exploit your property. We're here to protect it. That's our mission. Sorrell wanted to believe her. But 30 years of isolation had made trust difficult. After Dr. Rains left, promising to be in touch within days, Sorrell and Corin sat in the library with tea. The spring afternoon was warm, light streaming through the tall windows, but Sorrell felt cold. You're having second thoughts, Corin observed. I'm having all the thoughts. She wrapped her hands around her mug. This morning, Dr. Rains talked about bringing in a conservation team, cataloging the collection, creating a proper archival system. It all makes sense, but it also means strangers in every room. People touching things I've cared for alone for decades. They'll be professionals, people who understand preservation. I know. Logically, I know. But this castle, it's been mine, only mine. And now I'm handing it over to committees and bureaucrats and... She stopped, frustrated with herself. I sound ungrateful. You sound scared. That's different. Corin set down his mug. Can I tell you something? About why I do this work?
She nodded.
I got divorced 5 years ago. It was my fault, mostly. I'd gotten so caught up in safe, bureaucratic work that I'd forgotten why I became a historian in the first place. I'd stopped caring about the stories. Started seeing buildings as just paperwork and regulations. My wife, ex-wife, she said I'd become boring. She was right. He stared into his tea. After the divorce, I almost quit. But then I took on a project documenting an old mill that was scheduled for demolition. It was nobody's priority, just an assignment someone had to do. But when I went inside, when I saw the original machinery still in place, the workers' marks on the walls, I remembered why this matters, why preserving these places is about more than just buildings. It's about keeping connection to who we were, to the people who came before. He looked at her. When I walked into your entrance hall that first day, when I saw what you'd done here, I felt that again, that sense of purpose. You reminded me why this work matters. And I think maybe I'm reminding you that you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Sorrell felt unexpected tears building. She blinked them back. I don't know how to not carry it alone. It's all I've done for 30 years. Then it's time to learn something new, he smiled gently. You don't have to surrender the castle, Sorrell. You're just sharing the responsibility of protecting it. Adelaide started that process when she entrusted it to Thomas. Thomas continued it through his descendants. Uncle Thornton passed it to you. And now you're passing it forward, not to one person, but to a system designed to protect it forever. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Before she could respond, her phone rang. It was Wendell, his voice tight with urgency. Sorrell, you need to know. Preston Gill just called an emergency town council meeting. Tomorrow night. He's pushing for a property safety inspection. Claims there are structural concerns that affect the whole mountain. Says if the castle's foundations are compromised, it could cause landslides. That's absurd. Of course it is. But he's got people scared. And he's implying that if you won't sell, the county might have to condemn the property for public safety. Wendell paused. You need to be at that meeting. You need to fight this. After hanging up, Sorrell told Corin what Wendell had said. His expression darkened. Preston's making his move. He knows the designation will block him permanently, so he's trying to force the issue before it goes through. Can he actually do this? Get the property condemned? On false pretenses? No, but he can create enough fear and confusion to make your life very difficult. And if he gets the town council to vote for an inspection, you'll have to allow it, which means strangers tramping through the property looking for problems. Corin stood, pacing. We need to get ahead of this. Dr. Rains needs to know what's happening. And you need to be at that meeting with documentation, proving the castle is structurally sound. I don't have that kind of documentation. Then we'll get it. I know a structural engineer who works on historic buildings. If I call him tonight, he might be able to inspect tomorrow and provide a report by tomorrow evening. Sorrell felt the world spinning out of control. 1 week ago, her biggest concern had been rotted framing in one wall. Now she was facing public meetings, potential condemnation, and a developer who seemed determined to take her home by any means necessary. Adelaide hid her collection to protect it from people like Preston Gill, she said quietly. And here I am, about to expose it to the world. What if I'm making a mistake? What if opening the gates destroys everything? Corin came to stand beside her chair. Or what if closing them does? Sorrell, you can't protect this place through isolation anymore. Preston Gill has proven that. The only way to truly protect it is to make it valuable to more than just you. to give the community, the state, the nation a stake in its survival. That's what designation does. It says this matters to all of us, not just one woman on a mountain. She knew he was right, had known it all along, but knowing didn't make it easier. That night, she walked through the castle alone, touching walls, straightening paintings, checking window latches. Her nightly ritual, but now weighted with the knowledge that these might be her last days of solitude. Soon there would be engineers inspecting foundations, conservators cataloguing artwork, bureaucrats filing paperwork. The quiet sanctuary she'd built would fill with voices and opinions and official documentation. In the great hall, she stopped before Adelaide's portrait. The woman's painted eyes seemed to hold understanding. She'd faced her own crisis, her own impossible choice. Hide everything and hope it survived, or reveal it and risk losing it to greed. Adelaide had chosen to hide. But she'd also left that letter. When the world has moved past this era of greed and destruction, maybe that time was now. Maybe the world had evolved enough to value preservation over profit. Or maybe Sorrell just had to believe it had, because the alternative was losing everything anyway. She pulled the Ashford family signet ring from her pocket, the one they'd found with the jewelry. On impulse, she slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, as if 200 years of history had led to this moment, to her wearing the symbol of the family that had started all this. "All right, Adelaide," she whispered to the portrait. "I'll open the gates, but I'll do it my way, on my terms, and heaven help anyone who tries to turn your collection into profit." The portrait offered no response, but in the lamplight, Adelaide's smile seemed almost approving. Tomorrow she'd face the town council. Tomorrow she'd defend her right to her home. Tomorrow she'd begin the process of transformation that would change everything. But tonight the castle was still hers alone, and she intended to savor every quiet moment of it. The Millbrook Community Centre was packed. Sorrell hadn't seen this many townspeople gathered in one place since ever in her memory. She sat in the front row, Corin beside her with a briefcase full of documentation, Wendell on her other side providing moral support. Preston Gill sat across the aisle with two men in expensive suits, looking confident. He dressed for the occasion in business casual, projecting an image of concerned citizen rather than predatory developer. When he saw Sorrell, he offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The council members filed in, 5 local business owners and retired professionals who governed Millbrook's affairs on a volunteer basis. Sorrell recognized them all. Harold Beck from the general store, Susan Chen, who owned the diner, 3 others whose names she knew but whom she'd never spoken to directly. Council Chair Malcolm Reed called the meeting to order. We're here to discuss a petition brought by Mr. Preston Gill regarding property safety concerns at the former Thornton estate, currently owned by Ms. Sorrell Danvers. Mr. Gill, you have the floor. Preston stood, projecting concern and reasonableness. Thank you, Malcolm. I want to be clear that I'm not here to attack Ms. Danvers. I respect her property rights. But recent news reports have drawn attention to the condition of the castle on her property. And as someone who owns adjacent land, I have concerns about structural stability. He clicked through a presentation on a laptop, showing photographs, some clearly taken from distance with a telephoto lens, of the castle's exterior. He highlighted the moss-covered walls, the crumbling mortar in places, sections that did look weathered and ancient. Buildings of this age require constant maintenance, Preston continued. And while I'm sure Ms. Danvers has done her best, she's one person attempting to maintain what is essentially a 300-year-old fortress. The rock strata in this region is susceptible to erosion. If the castle's foundations are compromised, we could be looking at a collapse that affects the entire mountainside. Water runoff, soil stability, these are concerns that affect everyone in the valley. He paused for effect. I'm simply asking that the county conduct a professional structural inspection for public safety. If the building is sound, wonderful. Ms. Danvers has nothing to worry about. But if there are issues, they need to be addressed before they become catastrophic. Several council members nodded. It sounded reasonable, put that way. Sorrell felt her stomach tighten. Malcolm Reed looked at her. "Miss Danvers, would you like to respond?" She stood, her legs steadier than she'd expected. 30 years of town gossip and dismissal had prepared her for this moment, though she hadn't known it at the time. She'd learned to stand firm in the face of judgment. "Mr. Gill is right about one thing," she said, her voice clear. "The castle is 300 years old. But he's wrong about everything else." She nodded to Corin, who began distributing folders to the council members. "What you're holding is a structural assessment completed yesterday by a licensed engineer who specializes in historic buildings. He found that the castle's foundations are solid. The walls are sound. Yes, there's weathering. That's what happens to stone over 3 centuries. But there's no structural compromise and no risk to the surrounding area." She pulled out Adelaide's journal, handling it carefully. "This building has survived 300 years because it was built properly and because people have cared for it. I've maintained it for 30 years, and before me, my uncle did the same. Before him, his father. The chain of stewardship goes back to the building's construction," Preston interrupted. "With respect, Miss Danvers, you're not a structural engineer. You're a—" He paused, as if searching for a polite word. "Well, you've been living alone up there for a long time, without professional oversight, without permits for the work you claim to have done. You're right. I'm not an engineer. I'm a conservator." She let the word hang in the air. "I worked for 12 years at the Whitfield Museum before I came here. I was trained in architectural preservation, in material analysis, in the assessment and restoration of historic structures. And everything I've done to the castle has been documented." She gestured to Corin, who pulled out her restoration journal, 30 years of meticulous notes, photographs, sketches. The council members leaned forward, genuinely interested now. This wasn't the crazy hermit woman they dismissed. This was someone with credentials, with expertise. Sorrell continued, her confidence growing. "Mr. Gill says he's concerned about public safety. But his real concern is that he made me an offer to buy my property last week, and I refused. This inspection request is retaliation, an attempt to force me out through intimidation." Preston's face reddened. "That's a serious accusation. It's the truth." She looked directly at him. "You threatened me with code violations if I didn't sell. Now you're manufacturing a public safety crisis." "The pattern is clear." Preston Gill stood abruptly. "I don't have to listen to this slander. I've been a legitimate businessman in this region for 15 years. Sit down, Preston." Malcolm Reed's voice was firm. "Ms. Danvers has the floor." Preston sat, but his expression had turned hostile. The pretense of concerned citizen was slipping. Sorrell took a breath, steadying herself. This was the moment when she either retreated into the safety of isolation or stepped fully into the light. She thought of Adelaide, hiding her collection to save it. But Adelaide had also written that letter, hoping someone would eventually reveal what she'd protected. "There's something else the council should know," Sorrell said. "Mr. Gill mentioned recent news reports about the castle. Those reports are accurate. The estate contains one of the most significant collections of colonial-era art and artifacts in the region. It's been protected by my family for over 200 years, and I've continued that protection." She pulled out the letter they'd found in the wall, the one Adelaide had written to Thomas. This letter, written in 1809, establishes the history of the estate and its contents. It proves that the Ashford family deliberately preserved their artistic collection here, safe from creditors. And it establishes a clear chain of stewardship that leads directly to me. Corin stood, adding his professional voice to hers. "I'm Corin Mallory, historical surveyor with the State Preservation Office. Miss Danvers has submitted an application for historical designation, which Dr. Patricia Rains is personally overseeing. Based on the significance of the findings, we expect rapid approval. Once designated, the property will be protected by state law from demolition, forced sale, or significant alteration." Preston's face had gone pale. "You can't. The property taxes alone. will be managed through preservation grants, Corin interrupted smoothly. Standard practice for historically designated properties. Susan Chen raised her hand. Miss Danvers, I have to ask, and I apologize for the indelicacy, but years ago when you first came here, there were rumors about why you left your museum job. People said there was some kind of scandal. Sorrell had known this question would come, had dreaded it for 30 years. But now, standing before the town that had whispered about her for so long, she found she was ready to answer. There was a scandal, she said quietly. I authenticated a painting as a genuine Rembrandt study. The museum's major donor wanted it declared a forgery for insurance purposes. He had money and influence. I had only my professional opinion. The museum chose his money over my expertise, and I was asked to resign. She pulled out a folder Corin had prepared. 6 months after I left, independent testing proved I was correct. The painting was genuine, but by then I was here, and I had no interest in returning to a world where politics mattered more than truth. She distributed copies of the documentation, articles from art journals, the museum's quiet correction, expert opinions that vindicated her analysis. The council members read in silence. I came here broken, Sorrell continued. My career destroyed, my reputation ruined by people who valued money over integrity. Uncle Thornton gave me this castle and a purpose. I spent 30 years restoring it, protecting it, caring for it. Not for recognition, not for profit, but because it mattered. Because preserving beauty and history matters, even when no one is watching. Her voice strengthened. Mr. Gill sees the castle as a development opportunity, something to be bought, renovated, and turned into profit. But this building is irreplaceable. The collection it holds is irreplaceable, and I will not allow it to be destroyed or exploited, not by him or anyone else. She held up a document. This is the town's original charter, dated 1762. I found it in the castle's archives years ago. The estate predates the town's incorporation by 30 years. Under state historic preservation law, that means certain protections apply automatically, regardless of local ordinances. Malcolm Reed took the document, examined it carefully. This is genuine? Completely authenticated, Corin confirmed, which means any attempt to condemn the property or force Miss Danvers to sell would face significant legal challenges. The estate is protected not just by pending designation, but by its historical precedents. Preston Gill stood again, his composure cracking. This is ridiculous. You're all going to let one eccentric woman block legitimate economic development because of some old papers and dusty paintings. She's been laughed at for 30 years, and now suddenly we're supposed to take her seriously. The room went silent. Even Preston seemed to realize he'd gone too far. Harold Beck spoke up from the council table. Preston, I think you should sit down. No, someone needs to say what everyone's thinking. She's crazy. Always has been. And now she's found some old documents and convinced this surveyor that her falling down castle is important. But it's still just rocks and moss, and she's still just... Enough! Malcolm Reed's voice cut through Preston's rant. Mr. Gill, you're out of order. Council, I move to dismiss this petition for inspection. All in favor? 5 hands rose. Unanimous. Motion carries. Ms. Danvers, your property rights are secure. This meeting is adjourned. 3 months later, spring had given way to early summer. Sorrell stood at the castle's entrance, wearing the Ashford family ring and a dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion, the first new clothing she'd purchased in years. Behind her, the castle gleamed in morning sunlight, its stones cleaned of decades of accumulated grime, its windows sparkling. Today was the first public tour. A small group of 15 people waited at the gate. Historians, art students, Preservation Society members. They'd been carefully selected, their interest genuine rather than merely curious. Corin stood with them, having coordinated everything. He caught her eye and smiled encouragingly. Sorrell took a breath and opened the gate. Welcome, she said. Please come in. The group entered respectfully, quietly, their eyes widening as they took in the entrance hall. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, deciding what to show and what to keep private. The castle was still her home, and some rooms would remain hers alone. But these rooms, the ones Adelaide had filled with her collection, these were ready to be shared. She led them through the great hall first, where Adelaide's portrait had been properly lit and labelled. "This is Adelaide Ashford," Sorrell explained. "She built this collection over her lifetime, and when her husband's financial failures threatened it, she chose preservation over prestige. Everything you'll see today exists because she had the courage to protect it." In the library, visitors gasped at the collection of restored books. A young woman, a graduate student in conservation, Corinne had said, approached one shelf with tears in her eyes. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to a volume. "You may look, but please don't touch," Sorrell said gently. "Many of these are extremely fragile." The student nodded, studying the books from inches away. "The binding work is exquisite, museum quality." "Thank you," Sorrell said, and meant it. They moved through the rooms she'd prepared, the music room with its paintings, the chapel with its restored stained glass, the gallery where sculptures stood on pedestals she'd built herself. With each room, she told the stories, Adelaide's letters, the generations of caretakers, Uncle Thornton's deliberate choice, her own 30 years of solitary work. And something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling violated by their presence, she felt something like pride. These people understood. They saw what she'd protected and valued it not for money, but for meaning. Their appreciation validated 3 decades of effort in a way no amount of isolation ever could. After the tour, as the group filtered out with promises to return, to spread word in appropriate circles, to help however they could, Corinne stayed behind. "You did beautifully," he said. "It wasn't as terrible as I expected." "High praise," he smiled. "Dr. Raines called this morning. The designation is official. The castle is now on the State Register of Historic Places. You're protected, protected." The word carried weight she hadn't fully appreciated before. For 30 years, she'd protected the castle. Now finally, something was protecting her too. "What happened with Preston Gill?" she asked. She'd heard rumors, but avoided following the details. "His development company is under investigation for bribery and code enforcement violations. Turns out he'd been pressuring county officials for years, forcing property owners to sell through manufactured complaints. Several families have come forward. He's facing significant legal troubles." "Good. The town council issued a formal apology, by the way. For the years of, well, for everything." Corin pulled an envelope from his jacket. "And this came for you." Inside was a letter from the Whitfield Museum. Sorrell read it slowly, her hands trembling. The museum's new director had learned about the Ashford collection and Sorrell's role in preserving it. The letter acknowledged the injustice done to her 30 years ago, offered a formal apology, and extended an invitation to guest lecture on conservation techniques whenever she wished. "They want you back," Corin said softly. "Recognition, vindication, everything you lost." Sorrell folded the letter carefully. "I'm not interested in going back. That life is over. But you're not bitter about it." She thought about the question. Once she would have been. The Sorrell who'd arrived at this castle 30 years ago, heartbroken and humiliated, would have treasured this apology, would have seen it as validation of everything she'd lost. But the Sorrell, standing here now, who'd spent 3 decades building something meaningful, who'd protected history and found purpose, she didn't need their validation anymore. "I'm grateful," she said finally, "for the injustice that drove me here, for Uncle Thornton choosing me. For every lonely year I spent learning to listen to stones and trust my hands. If I'd stayed at the museum, if I'd fought for vindication then, I would never have found this. And this matters more than any career I might have had." Corin reached for her hand, squeezed it gently. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened. Not quite romance, neither of them was looking for that, but something more meaningful, partnership, understanding, shared purpose. "Next tour is scheduled for 2 weeks from now," he said. "And Dr. Raines wants to bring a team to begin formal cataloguing of the collection. With your permission. My permission." Sorrell smiled at the phrase. She still had control, still had choice. The gates were open, but they opened on her terms. She looked back at the castle, at the stones that had been her sanctuary and her salvation. Moss still grew on the north wall. She'd refused to remove all of it, liking how it softened the fortress's severity. The building looked exactly as it had for 30 years, and yet everything had changed. "Tell Dr. Raines yes," she said. "Tell her we're ready." That evening, alone again in her chamber, Sorrell sat with Adelaide's journal one last time before transferring it to the climate-controlled archive room they'd installed. She turned to the final entry, written shortly before Adelaide's death. "I will never know if my choice was right, whether hiding this beauty served it better than revealing it would have. But I made the choice I could live with, and I hope whoever comes after will understand. Not just what I saved, but why. Because beauty matters. History matters. And sometimes one person alone must stand as guardian until the world is ready to see." Sorrell closed the journal gently. "The world is ready now, Adelaide," she whispered. "And they're going to see everything you protected. They're going to understand." Outside, night settled over the mountain. In the valley below, lights flickered in Millbrook's windows. The town that had once mocked her now looked to her with something like respect. Not because she'd changed, but because they finally saw what had always been there. She pulled out Uncle Thornton's pocket watch, still stopped at 3:47, the hour she'd arrived, broken and desperate, the hour everything had changed. On impulse, she wound it. The mechanism caught, and the second hand began to move. Tick, 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 time flowing forward again after 30 years of being frozen. Sorrell set the watch on her nightstand and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new challenges, new ways of being in the world. But tonight, the castle was quiet and she was at peace. She'd opened the gates, not because she had to, but because she'd chosen to. And in that choice, she'd found not surrender, but strength. Not loss, but completion. The woman who'd arrived at this castle 30 years ago had been running from the world. The woman lying here now had learned to invite it in, carefully, selectively, on her own terms. And that made all the difference.